He walked into an old age shelter to donate in his father's name. What he found inside shattered everything he believed about his past. Veer Sinha wasn't just successful. He was a symbol of self-made wealth. From orphan to billionaire, his story was one of grit, ambition, and relentless discipline. People admired him, envied him, wrote articles about him. But Veer never forgot the one detail that shaped his life the most. He had no family, or so he was told. He had grown up in a government orphanage, adopted at age 8 by a stern, distant man who raised him more like an obligation than a son. His so-called father passed away a few months ago, leaving behind nothing but a note in the will. "Give something back in my name. It'll look good." So Veer did what was expected. He chose an elderly care shelter, one of the better-known ones in the outskirts of the city, and scheduled a surprise visit to personally offer a donation and check their conditions. He arrived unannounced, walked through the halls, greeted by the smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of old voices telling stories that no one visited to hear. He was about to leave after handing the check to the director, until he passed a small garden where an elderly woman sat alone under a tree, humming a lullaby. Something about that melody made him stop. He turned and felt the air leave his lungs. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way she held the corner of her shawl, in the curve of her eyes, in the softness of that hum. It wasn't possible. But his feet moved on their own. And when she looked up at him, those eyes, those exact eyes, his world tilted. Do I know you, ma'am?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. She stared at him, slowly placed a trembling hand on his cheek, and said, "My son used to look just like you." Veer stood frozen. No press cameras, no audience, just the whisper of leaves and the shaking hand of a woman who had just uttered words he couldn't ignore. "My son," she repeated, her eyes filling with a kind of ache that didn't look rehearsed. "They told me he died, but I always felt it was a lie." Veer's heart pounded. He couldn't look away. "What was his name?" She smiled sadly. "He didn't have one. I never got the chance to name him. He was taken the day after he was born." A chill ran through his spine. "That's not possible," he said carefully. "I was abandoned, left at a government hospital. That's what the records say." She looked down at her lap, pulling out a tiny cloth bundle, worn, yellowed, and tied with fading thread. She opened it gently. Inside was a rusted hospital tag. Barely readable, but the number matched the one Veer had seen on his own childhood file. The one he always thought was meaningless. "I stitched that tag into my blouse the day I gave birth, just for proof," she said, her voice cracking. "When they said my baby didn't survive, I didn't believe them. They didn't even let me see him." Veer sat beside her, trying to process it all. "Why would they do that?" She shook her head slowly. "I was poor, alone, unmarried. They said a rich couple wanted to adopt a baby quietly, and they paid the right people to make it happen." It sounded too painful to believe. And yet, something in him knew. The coldness of the man who adopted him, the lack of records, the nightmares he had as a child of being pulled from warm arms he couldn't remember. "Your name?" Veer asked. "Lakshmi." He pulled out his phone, opened his encrypted records, and searched for the name in the archives tied to his old file. There it was. Mother, Lakshmi Devi. Status, unknown. Child declared deceased. Veer stared at her, the puzzle pieces finally locking together. She hadn't just given birth to him. She'd been robbed of him. That night, Veer didn't sleep. He sat alone in his penthouse, lights dimmed, the city glittering beneath his feet. But nothing sparkled like the truth he had just uncovered. His entire identity, built on abandonment, was a lie. He hadn't been unwanted. He'd been stolen. By morning, his legal team had already begun digging. What they found confirmed everything. Lakshmi's file had been tampered with. Money had exchanged hands. A silent adoption had been arranged by his late adoptive father, who paid off hospital staff and ensured the trail went cold. Veer stared at the documents for a long time. And then he did what he'd never done before. He returned to the shelter, not in a suit, not with cameras, but in a simple shirt and jeans, holding a bouquet of marigolds and a photo from his childhood. When Lakshmi saw him again, she smiled softly. "I thought maybe it was a dream." "It wasn't," Veer said gently. "You're my mother." She covered her mouth, overwhelmed, her shoulders shaking. But Veer knelt before her and took her hands. "I don't know how to make up for the years we lost," he said, "but if you let me, I'd like to start today." A few days later. A photograph went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. It showed a millionaire walking into a shelter, hand in hand with an elderly woman in a simple sari. Veer announced the Lakshmi Home Foundation, a state-of-the-art care home for abandoned elderly women, in his mother's name. But more than buildings or press releases, he gave Lakshmi something she had once only prayed for at temple steps. A place in his life. She moved into his home, not as a guest, not as a project, but as his mother. She cooked for him, watched his interviews, woke him up with turmeric milk and old lullabies. And slowly, she began to heal too. Months passed, but Lakshmi still tiptoed around Veer's grand home as if afraid she'd break something, or worse, be asked to leave. One day, Veer gently placed her wrinkled hand over the nameplate outside his front door. "Veer Sinha and Lakshmi Deve." She gasped. You put my name here?" He nodded. "You brought me into this world. You held me for a day, and then suffered alone for a lifetime. But you were always my mother. You just didn't know where I was." Tears slipped down her face. That weekend he invited the media, not for fame, but to speak. At a small press conference, he stood beside her and said, "This woman is the reason I exist. The world calls me a self-made man, but the truth is, I was mother-made. I lost her because of greed and silence. I found her because truth has a way of coming home." The story spread across the country. Millionaire reunites with birth mother at shelter, rewrites family legacy. The woman they hid, the son she raised from a distance. But beyond the headlines, something far more beautiful bloomed. Veer didn't just bring Lakshmi home, he brought others home too. Forgotten mothers, cast-aside grandmothers, women who had no one now had a place in his foundation, and more importantly, in his heart. Each week, Lakshmi would teach them cooking, storytelling, laughter. Veer would visit, sit on the floor beside them, and listen. One evening, as he rested his head on Lakshmi's lap, she softly hummed the same lullaby he heard under the tree the day they met. "Do you remember this, Beta?" He looked up, smiling with tears in his eyes. "I don't think I ever forgot." 1 year later. On Mother's Day, a bronze statue of a woman holding a child was unveiled at the shelter gates. The plaque beneath it read, "To the mothers the world forgot, and the children who found them again." Because some bonds aren't formed by blood alone. They're shaped by silence, lost in time, and rewritten by love that never stopped waiting.